Okay, so I'm Jordy Izzard, and I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations at SAIS. And today is February 20th, 2014, and I'm here with Ed Wilson, who graduated from SAIS with his master's in 1968 and received his Ph.D. 4 years later in 1972. And we're here today just going to have a little bit of a conversation, and I thought, if it's okay, why don't we start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
I think it was experiences in Europe immediately after Princeton. I was 3 years in Oxford and absorbed a lot of wonderful experiences and made a lot of wonderful friends, and became interested in both Africa and Russia, which I had been for a long time, and also Italy, Bologna in particular. And I wanted to pursue a couple of specific topics, and my late dad happened to be a friend of then Dean Fran Wilcox, whose courses I took and enjoyed. And they were good enough to give me credit for some of the time that I had spent in Oxford. I was encouraged to go there immediately after Princeton by my wonderful Woodrow Wilson School historian, professor, definitive biographer of Lenin, Louis Fisher. In retrospect, I have advised others to take a year off or two and see the rest of the world, but I was in Oxford in that ivory tower, which became magnificent after the third year, but no degrees. So I really was interested in getting first the master's, but even more interested in the topic that I had almost concocted because of my interest in Africa through Princeton Woody Woo and through my long-standing interest in Russian history. So I matriculated in the MA program and was early on struck by the quality of the instruction, not just the dean, who had been the guy that was at the UN when Khrushchev took off his shoe and thumped it on the podium, but people like Hal Sonnenfeld, who inspired me after his hours in the government to do a blow-by-blow paper on the Cuban Missile Crisis, with which he was intimately familiar from the government point of view. And I found that to be an exhilarating experience because he knew the story, and he encouraged me in ways that Isaiah Frank in economics did. He was a powerhouse, and I was thereby led, in retrospect, well, during and then after, to realize that the SAIS degree then, as I think it still is very strong in economics, particularly international economics, and that was a quantifiable skill set, which then led me to look at and even hire SAIS grads, because I knew what that meant in terms of abilities and knowledge base.
What else do you remember about being a student at SAIS?
It was a lot of other good students, not just my arch rival and now wife Bonnie, but many people with fascinating international backgrounds, and some of them service in governments, although not as much as nowadays. And really very active minds and good instruction, and broad horizons in terms of the world and where it might be going. My background had been primarily in Russian studies and history.
Great. Yeah, do you have other thoughts on that? Because if not, I wanted to learn more about your career as well.
Well, the interest in the Ph.D. came more from my interest in the subject and desire to publish than in having another set of initials after my name. So I was fortunate to sort of dig up, mostly in the rare book collections at the Library of Congress, a story that had never been told before, Tsarist intrigue, beginning even before Nicholas II, the last Tsar, but reaching its zenith there when his confidential advisors were instrumental in making possible the victory of Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia over the Italians in the Battle of Ottawa in 1896. The first defeat of a modern European army by a third world country. And they did that by using the old Russian historical lessons of drawing in the enemy to the point where their supply lines could be cut off and were. And the Russians, through their similar religion in Orthodoxy and their naval interests, came within a hair's breadth of achieving a protectorate over Ethiopia back before the end of the Imperial Russian period. So I found that story absolutely fascinating, and fortunately was able to see it through to print and reviews and so forth, and even had the unexpected delight of having courtesy copies that were shared with both Brzezinski and Kissinger actually read by them. And those were funny stories about how I knew that Kissinger had really read Russia and Black Africa. But it was, the driving force was the intrigue and the story that had never been told, and it was pretty dramatic.
That's great. Terrific. And in that experience, while you were doing your PhD, did you end up spending any time in Russia?
I had already. For that purpose, it was mostly materials at the Library of Congress. And I was able to use both my Russian and my French in the research, and had traveled and gotten well acquainted with many Africans. But the subject, Russia and Black Africa before World War II, was a subject that had actually been described as non-existent by one author. So it was fun to show that
the existence. Yeah.
More than existence.
Yes.
It was intriguing.
Yeah, that's great.
So I'm a Russophile and basically an historian.
That's great.
Which then translated into art history, which is another issue. But before that happened, I spent a year in the Commerce Department in the then brand new Bureau of East-West Trade, writing papers for the Secretary and organizing trade missions to the then communist countries of Eastern Europe, who were very little interested in Nixon presidency and the State Department then, and anxious to meet with movers and shakers who were in companies, U.S. companies that were capable of delivering and implementing technology.
Mm-hmm.
And that then went on to a larger stage when I was asked to head up a year later a program in East-West relations for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We called it business diplomacy,
Mm-hmm.
and had the fascinating experiences of getting to know well many of the communist leaders of 5 Eastern European countries, including particularly the Poles, who were itching to get out from under the Moscow tutelage and from the straitjacket of a communist belief and go back to some of their agrarian and industrial roots, which they now have actually done. So our program actually got a Nobel Peace Prize nomination, which was kind of the sort of fun thing that you could put at the end of a resume and awards and nominations if you had a resume to submit. But anyway,
Terrific.
we felt we had an impact on those leaders.
That's terrific. And this was all before you received your Ph.D.?
No,
Okay.
it was immediately after.
Immediately after.
I
Okay.
went from the Ph.D. to a year at Commerce Department,
I
and then
gotcha.
about 5 years at the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay. So now we're 5 years out from receiving the Ph.D. And tell us a little bit about, from there, kind of how your career evolved.
Well, I would describe it as I have to students and recommend that it resolved in zigs and zags. Things don't really happen the way you expect them to.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I became, after the Chamber of Commerce, I became a banker, interested in knowing about business, but everybody's business. Had the unexpected pleasure of making the first art-secured loan in the history of Bank of America, even reluctant San Francisco approved, given the fact that for a $500,000 bridge loan, very minor loan to a wonderful collector, we had as collateral the last pair of Franz Hall's portraits in private hands, and those were estimated at between $15 and $20 million. So the business deal was good, and it was a lot of fun. And then other banks like Citi began to do the same thing, and now it's an established discipline in the banking world. And
Great.
from that, another zag, I started going into art investment in my own behalf, taking my own advice, and making a collection which had lots of discoveries. It was a little like a treasure hunt. One of the most dramatic experiences was finding a long-lost John Constable for the price of only $100 in a junk auction in New York, and 10,000% per year. I calculated my returns on the investment. It's now hanging in the Royal Academy in London as an authenticated constable. I'm working on a similar discovery for a friend of mine, but it was a long-lost masterpiece and needed all kinds of cleaning and authentication and so forth. And I've, in a couple of lectures, one was in Bologna, I've described the fun of taking that unexpected career turn and going into something which did, of course, involve history, which I basically have been all along, but also aesthetic and other disciplines.
I'll do something kind of fun, but like, for example, we've got an image up here. You want to tell us a little bit about this one?
That is not typical of the collection. That is Great Point Light in Nantucket, for those who know the island, done by Eric Sloan, who was the weatherman for a decade or more in the New York City area. But what I loved about it was the drama of the scene, and yet the authenticity of the weather formations. And he chose his own frame, which was driftwood.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's great. You know a lot about all
collection. The collection is basically 19th century realists, and has now an important sculptural dimension. So I have been selling to museums primarily, and to selected individuals. These artworks for almost the last 30 years.
It's amazing.
A hobby turned into a profession.
Exactly. And so part of the zig and the zag, not expected that would happen. Is that right? And tell us, what are some other zigs and zags that you kind of took in your trajectory?
Well, within art itself, there are all kinds of zags, like finding and buying fakes. I now have an authentic painting in a fabulously well-received exhibition that's now at Springfield Museum, and going to the Ringling at Sarasota, which includes forgeries hung next to the authentic ones. And the curator has found forgers who have produced imitations in 2 cases of paintings of mine, so they have the real one next to the famous forgery. So there's the drama of that. But life is never what you expect it to be, and I've been fortunate to have the couple of non-authentic works that I've purchased at auction from major auction houses taken back and had my money reimbursed, so I didn't actually lose.